the supply demand economics are so great that I just think that it's such a good trade to hold Bitcoin here. The only question you should have is how much do you want to own? That's it.
Yeah.
Not whether you should have it. You should have it. You should own it. And you should probably own it, just at a minimum for the next 10 years. You know what I mean? But then the question is, how much should you own, right? And, I think the starting to measure your net worth in Bitcoins, I think that's kind of like shifts the paradigm a little bit, It just seems like everything's kind of happening at once. The Trump administration's coming in, the Bitcoin reserve, the Saudis. I mean, I was reading today that the Russians are talking about possibly doing a Bitcoin reserve, So like all this stuff is like happening in 2025.
Fred Krueger sees a revolutionary future for Bitcoin, referring to 2025 as a possible turning point. According to him, countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia may decide to include Bitcoin in their reserves, which would completely change the cryptocurrency market. This change would confirm Bitcoin's status as a strategic reserve asset and worldwide store of value. According to Krueger, even small institutional inflows might significantly expand the size of the Bitcoin market in this situation, solidifying its position as a cornerstone of the international financial system. Krueger highlights that Bitcoin is not presently experiencing a speculative excitement, drawing on his vast expertise navigating 3 significant financial bubbles. He instead characterizes it as being in a bull market driven by strong dynamics between supply and demand, asset scarcity, and increasing adoption. According to Krueger, the main concern for investors is not whether or not they should buy Bitcoin, but rather how much. If you think this information is enlightening, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and enable post notifications for updates on cryptocurrencies and digital assets. Thank you for watching and enjoy the video.
I think we're just in this phase of changing the units, and it has the changing of the unit is a very, very significant thing, because
yes.
If we're moving to a thing where the U.S. government can create as many units as they want, to a new world thing where the units are 21 million of them. That's it. So I think that's the new thing, and as various people start to wrap their heads around what that means, I think everybody realizes they don't have enough Bitcoin. That's the problem. Most of this, the overall TradFi world has, the way I look at it, it has 0.1% exposure to Bitcoin. That's the number. Because if you think about it, there's well over $200 trillion worth of stocks and bonds, not even counting real estate. If you count real estate, you're getting to more like 500-600 trillion. And you've got, 2 trillion worth of Bitcoin. But they don't actually own, which would be about, let's say about 1%, right? But they don't own that Bitcoin. The TradFi only owns the ETF and MicroStrategy. So they only own about 10% of that Bitcoin. So they really have 0.1% exposure.
Yes. So it's very tiny.
Huge world with 0.1% exposure to the asset that's about to replace it.
Wow. That's an incredible way to think about it.
And if you start thinking it that way, it's like, what's the chance we get to, instead of 0.1%, 1%? If you get to 1%, that means you're going to have, let's just call it $2 trillion that come into this asset class. Well, you can't fit $2 trillion into a briefcase that is only, $2 trillion.
Yeah, it's not a TARDIS. So it's going to squeeze.
It's going to squeeze it up to, $20-30 trillion, right?
Yeah.
So, there's just no way that this transformation happens without Bitcoin just massively going up. Now, it doesn't necessarily massively go up tomorrow, It just seems like everything's kind of happening at once, like the Trump administration's coming in, the Bitcoin reserve, the Saudis. I mean, I was reading today that the Russians are talking about possibly doing a Bitcoin reserve.
Yes.
So like all this stuff is like happening in 2025, right?
Yep.
So if this stuff actually materializes right now, let's just say there's $200 billion that comes into Bitcoin, right? Yep. That's a lot. That's a whole lot. There's a lot more than came in this year. I mean, this year we had, between MicroStrategy and the ETFs, you probably had about $40 billion come in.
Yeah.
Okay, just in through those two things. But let's just say it goes from 40 to 200 at 5x next year, right?
Yeah.
Well, and let's just say it's split evenly between MicroStrategy and the ETFs. Well, the ETFs, they're going to put $100 billion, but into something that has a $2 billion market cap. But the other $100 billion that's going into MicroStrategy, that's going into something that has a $100 billion market cap.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So there's as scarce as Bitcoin is, MicroStrategy is more scarce, potentially in the super short term, right?
Yeah.
And there could be just this mountain. It's just, what is the size of the mountain of money that wants to get access to it, right?
Versus how small is the door.
And look, I think the mountain of money is very, very big. I think that's what everybody's like, underestimating this mountain of money. And, I just don't think that we're really anywhere close to even starting. We're not even in we're in the warm-up pitch. We might have thrown the first pitch.
Although institutional adoption of Bitcoin is still in its infancy, Fred Krueger believes it will accelerate as the financial advantages of the cryptocurrency become more and more obvious. He thinks the amount of money flowing into Bitcoin will increase dramatically, whether it comes from sovereign reserves, business balance sheets, or exchange-traded funds, ETFs. As Bitcoin continues to generate returns that beyond those of conventional assets, this expansion will be driven by both opportunity and necessity, such as protecting against inflation and the devaluation of fiat currencies. Krueger emphasizes how crucial early adoption is. The fixed quantity of Bitcoin will make it more difficult for latecomers to obtain sizable holdings as more institutions join the market. This gives those who act quickly and see Bitcoin's transformational potential a considerable advantage over others. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell for more in-depth analyses of macroeconomic and cryptocurrency trends. Now let's get back and hear what Fred Krueger has to say.
We're hitting some kind of, fulcrum point, where things just, at some point you just get into this pure FOMO. And, and for people who haven't been around as long as Mark and I just wanted to say, look, I've seen 3 of these bubbles now, like up close and personal. So all 3 of those bubbles, the one thing it's taught me is that for you to get to a real bubble, everybody's got to be convinced of the same thing. And once we get to that 100% conviction level,
then we're in a bubble.
That's when we can just completely crash. Because at that point, everybody's leveraged up, everybody's completely convicted. And now if we go down just a little bit, it'll just blow everything up. Right?
Cascading liquidations, and then everything destroys itself.
I think
And Bitcoin is not there yet?
No, Bitcoin is not there. Like on a financial level, it's not, right? Mm-hmm. So, Bitcoin as a result, as it relates to its own little Bitcoin cycle and miners, yeah, sure, Bitcoin's had, but not Bitcoin as a financial asset. Like, we're still at the point where there's all these Jason Calacanis's who don't really believe in it.
Doubting Jasons,
right? We have a lot of people like that, right?
Yeah, we do. There's a lot of naysayers.
We are not at the point where everybody and their brother wants to start a Bitcoin company and go. We are not there at all.
We are not there.
So I think in that sense, we're not at all in a bubble. We're in a bull market, but we're not in a bubble. The supply-demand economics are so great that I just think that it's such a good trade to hold Bitcoin here. The only question you should have is how much do you want to own? That's it.
Yeah.
Not whether you should have it. You should have it. You should own it. And you should probably own it, just at a minimum for the next 10 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
even Jason owns it. So just
Yeah, he owns a little bit. But then the question is, how much should you own, right?
Yeah.
And, I think the starting to measure your net worth in Bitcoins, I think that's kind of like shifts the paradigm a little bit, everybody else in the S&P 500 is thinking dollars. They're thinking dollars per share, earnings per share in dollars, right? Price to earnings in dollars, right?
Yep.
Now, but if you look at price to earnings in Bitcoin, it's a very different metric, right? Because if you think about, let's just say you say, okay, great. How much is Microsoft earning in Bitcoin?
Yeah.
And then you go, okay, they're earning this amount per dollar per share, and that's growing at this amount per, But then you go, the amount that they're earning in Bitcoin is actually going down in Bitcoin.
Right.
They're getting less and less Bitcoin, right?
Yep.
And the Bitcoin that they have $100 million right now, $100 billion, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. $100 billion, if they sold that today, they could buy pretty much Satoshi's Nakamoto's stake. They could buy $1 billion.
They could buy a stack. Yeah.
They could buy a stack, right? How much are they going to be able to buy 2 years from now?
Half the stack.
Half the stack.
It's
right?
going to be half. Yeah.
Which is called, by the way, he has a name for it. It's called one Nakamoto.
I didn't know that. That's
so they're currently valued at one Nakamoto, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to ooze down to half a Nakamoto or a quarter Nakamoto pretty soon.
Yes, they are.
Meanwhile, MicroStrategy is going to go to one Nakamoto.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. So if you think about it, MicroStrategy is the only company in the entire S&P 500 that's accreting. They've issued, I think, $6.5 billion worth of $7 billion worth of debt right now.
Yeah.
But they've got like $40 billion worth of Bitcoin.
Right. So they could just pay it off at any time if they wanted to right now. And have
but what I'm just saying
headroom.
is, they don't have a massive amount of debt relative to the amount of Bitcoin that they have today.
Yep.
Bitcoin doubles, which it probably will. It's going to be nothing, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to have any, and of that, only 10% is due in 2027. Like, they have no real problem right now, right?
Yeah.
There's no debt crisis problem. That's not a problem. And what they've done is they've laddered all their debt. So, it's coming at 2027, 28, 29, 30,
Fred Krueger emphasizes that we are far from a speculative bubble in his concluding remarks, making a strong argument for the inclusion of Bitcoin in both personal and business strategies. Instead, strong supply-demand fundamentals are driving the current bull market. According to Krueger, investors should consider how much to invest rather than whether or not to buy Bitcoin. In order to truly benefit from Bitcoin's potential, he suggests a minimum horizon of 10 years and encourages long-term ownership. In his argument that assessing value in Bitcoin offers a distinct and perhaps revolutionary perspective, Krueger questions traditional financial analysis criteria like profitability and valuation in fiat currency. Companies like Microsoft, for example, may report increasing profits in dollars, but because of Bitcoin's increasing value and scarcity, their earnings in Bitcoin are declining. Conversely, businesses like MicroStrategy, which actively collect Bitcoin, are witnessing an increase in their worth in terms of Bitcoin, which puts them in a unique position inside the S&P 500. By comparing companies and assets in Bitcoin instead of dollars, Krueger draws attention to the paradigm shift that may reshape the way wealth and commercial performance are evaluated. He emphasizes that because of its limited quantity, early adoption is crucial because the value of Bitcoin decreases over time. MicroStrategy is a pioneer in this regard, having positioned its assets and debt to take advantage of Bitcoin's rising value. The main conclusion is obvious. Owning Bitcoin is now required, with timing and allocation being the most important considerations. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.